Welcome to MSP Dispatch on April 22nd, 2022, your source for news, community events, and commentary in the MSP channel. Joined as always by my co-host, Tony Francisco. Tony, how you doing, my friend?
Excellent. Got Wordle on the second try. I'm doing amazing today. How are you doing, Ray?
I'm good, man. I see the number of like Wordle alternatives that keep happening. I haven't gotten into it so far. I know of Wordle. I tried 2 or 3 times, and I'm more of a Sudoku guy. So
Quordle, Quordle. Quordle. It's 4 Wordles at the same time. Not that I have an addiction problem or anything, but
yeah, maybe we'll do another segment on the games and the time they waste for us.
Let's get into the news.
Like a good. Let's get into the news. All right. In our first story, President Biden signs into law the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. This act will require reporting within 72 hours of understanding an incident has occurred. It's going to apply to covered entities. Now, these covered entities have not been identified yet. They will be identified by CISA at a future date. The rules for what is considered a substantial incident is also going to be TBD by CISA at a later date. If you pay a ransom, you need to report that ransom within 24 hours of making the payment. The reports will be considered confidential. They cannot be used by CISA for any other purposes. And failure to comply will be referenced over to the Department of Justice for potential enforcement. Tony, with the amount of events we're seeing in the public sector today, and previously CISA had defined a few things on what they called critical infrastructure, and it kind of just applied to almost everybody. What do you think about this? You know, some say pay the ransom, some say don't pay the ransom. Here they're saying if you need to report for sure, there needs to be transparency, and you need to tell us if you pay. Is this requiring an extra level of transparency? Do you see any negative impacts?
Ray, these are all good points. I think what we're really talking about is accountability. We're talking about communication. We're talking about servicing your customers the best that you can based on situational awareness, and understanding that an incident does occur or has occurred is one thing, but understanding what your plan, your path to resolution, what your plan is to not only resolve this but prevent it in the future with the initial apology is critical. And these are things that have been they have not been enforced. And if they can be enforced, which is going to be a very difficult process, I think that's a step further in the right direction. However, what is that going to result in regards to penalties? It's bad enough that you've already been impacted as a company via a hack, via ransomware. And with ransomware attacks approaching monumental levels, increasing double-digit percentages every quarter for the last 3 years. What is the impact going to be that could be worse than ransomware? There's so many questions that pop up to this, Ray. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, it strikes me that, this may be more of shooting the flare up in the air so you see what's to come, right? We don't have a description. We don't have determination yet what's critical infrastructure or what a covered entity is. We don't have determination yet what a substantial event is. We don't have the contents of the report. Even that, what's going to constitute a viable report, that is TBD. This was put out by CISA, or this was put into effect in March, and here we are a few weeks later, and we still haven't seen the final results of that. I think it's more of a, this is coming, you need to start preparing for this kind of thing. This is very much in line with the Forbes article of requiring CISOs to be on boards, right? This is very much here's the sign of what's coming, start preparing, because the enforcement's going to come, but we're giving you an opportunity, a thinly veiled opportunity to start putting your ducks in a row.
I would love to talk about that at a later time. You glazed over that very, very briefly, but the Forbes article that talked about, CISOs being required to be at the board level of public companies. There could not be a better step in prevention and accountability than that. That is a root portion of the structure in regards to accountability. I'm interested. We can talk about that at a later time. I'm certain that it'll do amazing things for the CISO community, for the MSP community as a whole, understanding that the very companies that they're reselling are going to be accountable and structured in a proper way.
And one of the things you get from a CISO is having, a CISO usually is more adept and properly trained on having proper incident response guidelines. And I believe that takes us into our next story.
Absolutely. So, speaking of responses, ConnectWise introduces incident response services, which is an enormous release for the community as a whole. The available on demand service will be available soon. And from what we're understanding, the partners can buy incident response help in an ad hoc fashion or incident specific basis, or subscribe to a retainer for services purchased in 20-hour blocks for $300 per analyst hour. Ad hoc services will become available in about 2 weeks. Raphael Marty, who is the former, and I apologize, ConnectWise Senior Vice President of Product Management for Cybersecurity, states that ransomware incidents rose by an average of 10 to 15% every quarter in 2021, which goes back into the discussion we just had a moment ago. And post-breach services in particular are a necessity in the age of rampant and increasingly sophisticated exploits. Ray, I have so many questions about this because this is such a positive move by such a well-known organization. What are your thoughts on the ancillary impact of this offer?
So, it's not a far cry to say, I've always been the proponent of stay in your lane, right? You don't have to be the expert at absolutely everything. I've referred to MSPs as the general contractor of a housing build, right? Or the project manager. You're going to bring in your electricians, your plumbers, your roofers, and whatnot, even your architects, your engineers. So to say an MSP maybe should not be handling security events, should not be handling IR, that's not a far cry. However, there are many MSPs, or the newer term MSSPs, that do focus on IR, that do focus on having the capabilities to do these deep dive events and then do forensics and provide appropriate response or remediation. So there is a subset of MSPs and also other vendors in the community that offer these services. So when you have a major vendor like ConnectWise or Kaseya or Datto come in and say, we're not only offering platform, right? Because ConnectWise has Perch, so they have SOC SIEM services, they have other ancillary security services. But now when they're offering the IR response, they're stepping onto the toes of the MSSP. That's a very fine line to walk when the vendor is possibly competing against its intended client. We've seen Microsoft do this. We've seen other partners do this, or other vendors in the old adage, right? Don't get Dell'd, where Dell will go back and quote something against you with your own client that you've registered. Have you ever had that? When you have a vendor try to compete against you with your intended client audience?
We've all had that. We've all had that. Interesting question, though. Taking the other side of that concern, could this be a huge addition, an augmentation to an existing MSP's skill set? That could be a resold service, although it's provided by a very vendor that you already have set into your technology stack and in the presence of each of your customers. In some cases, could this be an enhancement to your existing service as an MSP? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I like to give both sides of the coin so our audience can go back and decide for themselves. At its core, I don't actually think that they're stepping on toes. I think it's another value-added service from a notable vendor. One of the hard parts in finding all these other solutions or finding vendors to come into your stack is it's the MSP, right? The MSP channel has thousands, if not, it almost feels like millions of vendors at this point, and there's so many AVR, EDR, OPP, UNIT. There's so many different vendors, so many acronyms. It's hard to qualify what's the good one, what's the not so good one. So when you have a major, a big four or big three soon, vendor coming out and saying, okay, we offer this service, and maybe if there's some kind of it does come with an inherent level of trust, an inherent level of credibility that the MSPs can rely on and add it to their stack as a resold service with maybe the vendor they're already buying services from today. So it makes sense.
Speaking of large vendors that are trusted by the MSPs, is there another story regarding that?
Absolutely right. And that takes us to our next story of Syncro MSP, the software for MSPs that offers PSA and RMM style solutions, has announced that they're going to be shuttering their file level backup service. This backup service, which is still pretty early in its infancy. Earliest I saw that goes back of November 2020. The backup solution started at $4 a license and included up to 50 gigs of backup per license. They sent an email out earlier this week advising that they're going to be shuttering the service as of September 1st, 2022. The email doesn't advise exactly how you're going to get your backups out or what the recommended plans are. It just advised they're going to be shuttering. And looking at their website, they still do have tons of content up advising the Syncro backup still live. So I'm assuming these things will be taken off soon enough. Tony, we see this all the time where, especially Microsoft's notable for this, but other vendors do it too. They put out a service and they see how it goes and they'll shut it down eventually if it's for one reason or another. It's not sustainable. It's not profitable. It's too difficult to maintain, whatever it happens to be. But when I look at something as critical as backups, we're not talking we're not talking some display signage. We're talking backups that are critical in this era of ransomware, in this era of security breaches and events. Your backups are critical, and now they may be gone in a few months. And there's tons of other options, but this has to affect your vendor selection, your confidence in a vendor. What say you? I mean, is this odd? Is this just par for the course? What are your thoughts on this?
I'm concerned why they didn't sell that service to another backup provider. You have Wasabi, you have Backblaze, you've got so many, you have so many relevant backup services in the MSP community that focus solely on the backup service. And if you are leaving your customers in the lurch, does that mean that maybe this isn't a good service for them now and they're going to revisit that at a later time? Does it mean that they really had such a small audience or such a small penetration that it wasn't worth selling? And this is more of a newsworthy from headline alone than it is from the customer impact perspective. There's a lot of questions that I have. Is this going to be revisited by them at a later time? Or frankly, was it just they realized the juice wasn't worth the squeeze when they initially created it? I have a lot of questions about the underpinnings from the operation side, how it was deployed, why it was developed, what the actual market penetration was, which of course would tell me exactly why they didn't sell that particular service or partner with Backblaze or Wasabi or all the other credible backup providers out there.
I did reach out. I did reach out to Syncro to get some background on the story to find out if this was something they had created, how long they had created, been working on building this for, or if this was simply a resold product that was rebranded. And that happens a lot in the space too. And that brings its own level of questions, right? Its own additional questions, like you're talking about, where if they built this from scratch, one, why would you build from scratch when there's so many other options in the space? And two, if they build this from scratch, to be able to shutter it so quickly, I mean, you're shuttering in less than 24 months, closer to 18 months. That's an incredible loss of R&D and development time and funds. It makes me wonder what could have been so bad that they would have shut it. And I don't want to prognosticate. Absolutely, it's just a weird thing for something to come and go so quickly. It leaves a lot of options. If you were using Syncro backups, if you were, and you have any additional information on how this impacts you as an MSP or what your feelings are on the subject, please reach out to us, news@mspmedia.tv, or tweet us at mspmedia TV, and we'll be definitely, we'll bring it up on a future episode. And Tony, speaking of creative, these ransomware groups are getting really creative, not only with their methods, but also their targets, right?
Absolutely. Ransomware gangs are back, and they're hitting something new and dear to all of us: food. Businesses in the farming and agriculture industries have been warned by the FBI that they should be prepared to face an increase in ransomware attacks at critical times like spring planting or harvest. As mentioned at zdnet.com, then since 2021, there's been multiple agriculture cooperatives that have fallen victim to ransomware attacks. Conti, Black Matter, Suncrypt, Our Evil is a big component of this, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And some of the victims have had to actually halted all production, and that is devastating during those particular times. Our Evil, as we have heard before, they are back. The infamous Our Evil ransomware gang appears to have returned in business after months of being taken offline after members being arrested. That is, we've talked about before on this show. They first appeared in 2019 with a prolific ransomware group linked to dozens of attacks, and they now have a Join Us page that's written in Russian and explain how others can become affiliates of the gang with a promise of an 80-20% split on ransomware collected. Lots of ransomware issues out there. Please, folks, be safe and protected.
And in other notable news, speaking of phishing, and if you remember, we had Connor Swam from FinSecurity on Monday. You should go back and see that story talking about phishing and the prevalence and what it means for your organization. But in a story of how not to do it, a hospital sent out phishing simulation tests over to their employees, and it offered up to $7,500 in financial assistance to their employees. Obviously, this was a test to see what they would click on and what they wouldn't. And you can imagine the number of pissed off nurses and doctors and hospital administrative staff that were not happy about something they should have been happy about. This goes back to what Connor was talking about, what we were talking about. It's not so much, what you do, it's how you do it. There's a right and wrong way to do phishing simulation, do security testing. You have to remember at the end of the day, these are people. These are, once the test is done, you are going to have people later on that you're going to have to see in the hallway and have some coffee with and be at the water cooler. So don't do this. Don't send an email out talking about, there was the other CEO that talked about giving out bonuses and commissions for Christmas time. And that was also a phishing attempt or a phishing test. So don't be that company pissing off your employees with your phishing testing. But we have good news as well. Let's show what the community events are coming up for the following week. And these are the list of upcoming events for this week and the week coming up in the MSP community. We'll have links to all of these in our show notes as always. If there's events that you want to know about, please hit us up, news@mspmedia.tv, and we'll be happy to include it on there. And with that, that brings us to a close on MSP Dispatch for April 22nd, 2022. Tony Francisco, thank you so much as always for your key insights and commentary on these stories. What do you have coming up for the following week?
Try to match my second attempt solving Wordle. That's all I have, and focus on the MSP news. That's all I have. That's it. It's good enough for me.
And maybe go buy a laptop to go build with your sons, huh?
That's a whole new story.
That's a story for another time. If you want to hear about the laptop story, hit up Tony on his socials or hit us up, news@mspmedia.tv. And thank you so much to our MMN family out there in the chat and in the socials. Hit us up on our social media, hit us up LinkedIn or news@mspmedia.tv. We want to hear from you. Until next week, take care of yourselves and each other.
See you, everyone.
This has been a broadcast of the MSP Media Network.